everyone, and welcome to the Science Corner. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Jud Brewer. We are delighted to have him as our guest today, and I'm going to turn it over to Jud to say a little bit about his background.
Thanks, Tara, and thanks for having me. I'm the Director of Research and Innovation at Brown University's Mindfulness Center. I'm also an associate professor in the departments of Behavioral and Social Sciences, as well as psychiatry in the medical school at Brown.
All right. Well, thanks so much. And thank you again for agreeing to do this. So, Jud, my first question is that, a lot of your research has been covered by the media of late. And what do you think the media tends to get wrong in talking about mindfulness practice and research? Is there something that, the public should be aware of, to be kind of on the watch for? What do they get wrong and what do they get right?
Well, I would say they get a lot right. And there are, the more inquisitive and curious the reporters are, I find, the more they're actually able to get some of the nuances. But I think they really face a tough, a tough obstacle where they've got to get some really nuanced and specific things down in a way that the readers can understand them, and also in a way that they can keep people's attention. So they've got a tough haul to start with. I would say the two things that I've seen most commonly, at least when people have been interviewing me or been writing about my research, has been they don't quite understand how mindfulness is about changing one's relationship to thoughts, emotions, and body sensations. There seems to be this meme that still infects some reporters that it's about clearing our head or changing our thoughts or getting rid of stuff. And I don't know if that comes from there's been a long tradition of people reporting on cognitive behavioral therapy, which is about changing cognition. Right. But here mindfulness is very different. It's about changing our relationship to things. That's the first piece. The second piece is I see a lot of emphasis on kind of oversimplification of the brain. There's, for some reason, the amygdala has emerged as this fear organ, and that's not really, it's involved in fear, but it's a lot more nuanced than that. And I think people like to have, very simplified understandings of the brain. Mm-hmm. But this is where I see it get oversimplified to the point where it actually becomes, you want to have it simple, but you don't want to have it oversimplified where it actually detracts from the actual story there. So those are the two that I see the most.
Yeah, interesting. I noticed that as well when I'm watching interviews. And it's like, I think just the interviewer having a lack of knowledge about what mindfulness actually is. Yeah, that's helpful, Jud. And I think the oversimplification too, because you don't want to, we really, because this is so new in our common culture, I mean, it's not it's an ancient practice, but I do worry a bit about misconceptions getting carried along, and it's like we've got to really sort of try to catch it early and correct. Yeah.
So here's an irony that I've noticed. I'm reading this great book by Alan Alda, who's gotten, later in his career, he's gotten very interested in science communication. I think the book's entitled something like, if I understood what you're saying, would I have this look on my face, or something like that. Great book. But he talks about, so he's giving all these examples of where he was doing this series for, I think it was for the Discovery Channel, or I'm going to get that wrong, but some television show where he was interviewing a bunch of scientists about their work. And what he realized was that he didn't really have to know much about what they were doing. And in fact, the less he knew, the better his interviews went. All he had to do was be curious. And so he was actually embodying one of the main qualities of mindfulness, perhaps without even knowing it. So I would say, for any reporters, the idea here, the irony, the paradox, the whatever, is that if they're just curious and, don't assume that they know what mindfulness is, they're going to actually get it, better, because they'll ask the right questions and they'll be curious, and they'll also be, they'll be embodying what mindfulness actually is.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Just such a great point. The curiosity. So they don't actually really need to necessarily know, but um, and in a way, maybe keep what they've heard at bay and enter that kind of curious mindset. Yeah, that's really great. Interesting. But in general, I think, one of the hardest things for us as humans is uncertainty. I mean, most of us like to have information that can sort of tamp down the fear factor a bit. And, but given the degree of social, political, and environmental unrest that we're dealing with right now, and the subsequent or consequent uncertainty, can you explain the physiology of anxiety? Like, what is actually going on, and how could mindfulness help?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the first place to start is just understanding that information is kind of food for our brain. So our brains are set up to predict the future based on previous experience. And they can predict better based on how certain information is, so if, it's like the weather, if it's a 90% chance or 100% chance of raining tomorrow, you're more likely to get an umbrella versus, or look out the window and wait and see. So then you're not sure, do I get an umbrella or not? So here, if our brains, they really hate uncertainty, because when things are uncertain, our brains are trying to do these predictions, and they're coming up with this what if scenario, because it could be this, it could be that, maybe I should bring my jacket, maybe I should bring my umbrella, maybe I shouldn't go out at all, whatever. So here, if you look at today's environment, we have a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and we even had this BC, before COVID-19. Right. Political uncertainty. You never knew what the president was going to tweet one day to the next. Environmental uncertainty, some job uncertainty, but that uncertainty has certainly increased. And now look with pandemics, for example, especially at the beginning of a pandemic, there's a huge amount of uncertainty when people don't know how deadly the virus is, and they don't know how contagious it is, and they don't know how to treat it and all this stuff. And that just makes our brains, it's like our heads, the smoke starts to come out of our ears, and we start to go nuts, because our brains are trying to predict what to do, and they have no idea what to do, especially if they haven't run into a scenario like that before. None of us that are alive have ever been alive during a pandemic like this before, right? Just as an example. So that's the first key thing to know, is that, uncertainty is something that our brains don't like, because the more information they can get, the more things, the more they can predict for the future. And that prediction makes, it comes in the form of feeling, feeling comforted or solid in what you know. So uncertainty feels bad because it's our brain saying, hey, make this go away. And it actually urges us to go get information, which is probably why many of us are spending way too much time, checking the news and checking our social media feeds to try to get more information. So that's the first piece. Now, how that spins into anxiety, it might seem obvious to some, but I'll just spell it out. That prediction machine in our brain that's trying to predict the future, it kind of spins out into these what if scenarios that turn into worry. So, it's like, oh, maybe this will happen. Maybe this will happen. Oh, I'm worried that this will happen. I'm worried that will happen. So they kind of get this twinge of fear in them. And that fear plus uncertainty equals anxiety, right? And then it just compounds on itself, because the worry makes us feel more anxious. That anxiety makes us feel more worried. And then, we go over that event horizon into that black hole of anxiety.
Vicious cycle.
Yes.
Yeah. Is there a point at which we can break in? Like how when you find yourself in that spiral?
Yes, fortunately, there is hope. There is something that we can do. So, imagine, for those that don't know what an event horizon is, we can geek out on space a little bit. So black holes have such a strong gravitational force that when you get close enough, nothing can actually, there's no force that's strong enough to help you get out of the black hole. So that's why they call that an event horizon, because you're going in no matter what. This is the point where light cannot even escape. So black hole's gravitational force is so strong that it pulls light in, hence the black hole, right? Wow. So think of this event horizon. So many of us can feel like anxiety. Certainly my patients feel like anxiety can
Yeah,
be this black hole where it just sucks them in, and it just, they just get deeper and deeper and deeper as their anxiety spirals out of control.
right.
So what can help our brain kind of not go over that event horizon is a couple of simple things. The first one is just recognizing that we are kind of spiraling out in anxiety and worry. And one way to do that is to just kind of map out, these habit loops around anxiety, which are actually pretty simple. 3 steps, a trigger, a behavior, and a result. So the
Yep.
trigger often is anxiety itself. The behavior is a mental worry. So mental behaviors count as behaviors.
Mhm.
So anxiety can trigger worry, and that worry results in making us feel like we're doing something, right? Because even if I can't control the
Right.
future, at least I can worry about it.
So true. Like I'm being constructive.
Yeah, constructive in the sense
Right,
that it
right.
feels like we're doing something. The
Yeah.
problem is it's constructive in the sense that it just kind of hits our jets and moves us toward that black hole of anxiety, so we get more anxious.
Yes.
So
Yes.
so what we can do to kind of cool our jets here and turn the other direction is to simply bring awareness in and start to map out these habit loops and see, oh, here's anxiety, it's triggering worry. Here's worry, it's actually making things worse, right? And that making things worse piece, becoming aware of that, can actually help us become less excited about worrying in the future, right? That's how our brains actually change
Yeah,
behavior,
yeah.
is based on how rewarding a behavior is. So, if they see that worry isn't actually getting them anywhere, they start to become disenchanted with that old behavior.
Yes.
And so they might that can help them move away from worrying. In fact, my lab's actually done research on this, where we've done studies with app-based mindfulness training program. We've got one study with anxious physicians. We got a 57% reduction in anxiety, and another study with people with generalized anxiety disorder. They're the Olympians of worry, I think of them that way.
That's great.
63% reduction in a randomized controlled trial.
Wow.
So mindfulness really can help. And we've even mechanistically mapped that out, where we can show
Yeah.
that increases in mindfulness decrease worry, and that decrease in worry mediates a decrease in anxiety.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. One meditation teacher that's been really important for me is Joseph Goldstein. And one of his questions is often, does it help? Like, does it help? Yeah, interesting, because I come from a long line of like great grandmothers, grandmothers, mothers. They're all warriors. Like they're really doing something, and they are doing something constructive. It's just in the opposite direction. So yeah, like, does it help? Um, is one of the things that I teach in working with people, is that the more you have a regular daily meditation practice, the more the awareness will be available and accessible to you. Do you want to say anything about that?
I'd be happy to. And there's this saying that comes, I think, from Tibetan Buddhism, where they talk about short moments many times, which I like because, a lot of my research is around changing habits. And one way to form a new habit is to do that behavior, short moments, many times throughout the day.
Yes.
So here, in some of our research has borne this out with smoking cessation, where we found that actually, as people bring mindfulness to the activities, as they're paying attention when they smoke, and as they pay attention when they use mindfulness to ride out those cravings, the more they can do those in the moment exercises,
Yes.
the more they can actually break those bad habits, whether it's smoking. I see this also with emotional eating, and also with anxiety. So here I would say, these short moments many times are very helpful. And of course, I grew up, my meditation practice started with, more formal meditation practices. Those have also been shown to help people, work with any type of habits that we've worked with. So here I would say pairing these in the moment practices, bringing mindfulness to the moment when somebody's struggling with a bad habit, for example, but also kind of setting the stage for the day, providing a grounding or a foundation of kind of stability of awareness, by doing some mindfulness practice at the beginning of the day. If people have time to do that, that's also extremely helpful.
Yeah, and I think, it doesn't have to be long drawn out, 45-minute hour practices, but I think, starting with a foundational short practice to help inform the many moments throughout the day. And I think, these habit tendencies are so automatic we don't think about them. So it's really interesting to think, can I start paying attention to smoking? And what is that experience really like? And can I pay attention to food in a way that I don't normally, and my body, how full am I or not? Like these are so automatic, and now you're really helping to draw attention to let's bring it back and see, what does it actually feel like?
Yeah, I guess one way of putting that would be you can train people to mind the moment.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Yes, you can. How has your own practice or research changed through your interaction with patients? Like, what have you learned from your patients?
Oh, where do I start? I learn so much from my patients all the time. I
Yeah.
would say so I'll give a couple of examples.
Okay.
So one we were developing this app called Eat Right Now to bring some mindfulness to help people work with disordered eating, like binge eating or emotional eating. So I was working with a bunch of patients in my clinic who had binge eating disorder, where it's basically uncontrolled eating. They would just keep eating and eating. And that actually maps out pretty well with these habit loops. Negative emotions would trigger them to binge. And then one of my patients put it really succinctly. She said it helped me numb out. She could numb out from her binging. And she would binge on like entire large pizzas 20 out of 30 days a month. So she was really doing that a lot.
Yeah.
So I was working with a group of people with binge eating disorder, and I learned that they actually had no idea what the difference between physiologic and psychological hunger was. Basically, they would have a craving to eat, and they couldn't tell if they were actually physically hungry or if it was just satisfying this urge to eat because they had a negative emotion.
Yeah.
So I still remember this because this was so interesting to do. I walked up to the whiteboard with a group of them, and we actually just mapped this out. Like what's the difference between it's called homeostatic hunger versus hedonic hunger, which is just fancy terms for are you actually physically hungry versus is it your mental state? And I could just see light bulbs go off in all of their heads. They're like, oh, wait a minute, we don't differentiate this. And in fact, that's one of the key aspects of helping people start to break these cycles of binge eating is to see, are they going to food because of emotions or are they going to food because they're actually hungry? And it helps them recalibrate those hunger signals in their body so they can actually respond to the ones that are helpful, help them eat when they're hungry, and also be able to ride out cravings when they have an urge to eat that's driven by emotion. So that's one thing that I've learned. I've learned a ton from my patients who have anxiety as well. So one, I didn't even actually know that anxiety was this habit loop until I started working with patients and started looking into this more. That habit loop that I just described earlier.
Yes.
It turns out that there's a large literature going back to the 1980s showing that these behaviors can be reinforced in the same way that eating behaviors can be reinforced.
Right.
And the other thing that's been very interesting that folks might find helpful, certainly my patients do, is being able to learn the difference between stress and anxiety, right? So stress tends to have a trigger, like this is mental stress, not physiologic, like fight, flight stress, but mental stress. So, a to-do list is a example, or looking at somebody's, if somebody has a bunch of emails, they haven't checked their inbox in a while and they look at their inbox and suddenly they're like, or they get an email from their boss and they don't even need to, they just see it's from their boss and suddenly they're stressed out, right? They don't even know what it said. It could be that you just got a raise, but it tends to be not the emails that we get from our bosses. So mental stress tends to be triggered by a thing. And if you work with that thing, then the stress can go away. So if your to-do list is stressing you out and you check off your to-do list, then that stress tends to get alleviated.
Yeah.
Anxiety is different. So stress can actually become anxiety where, it forms this anxiety as a habit loop, but anxiety itself can just come up. I have so many patients who, they wake up in the morning and as soon as they're awake, they're anxious,
Yes.
and then they're anxious throughout the day and they're looking for what it is that's causing that anxiety.
Yeah.
And the more they look, the more they start worrying, and then anxiety then turns to that worry, and then the worry spins back on the anxiety, and then they're actually making themselves more anxious. So that's another thing that I learned. And then the overarching thing that I've learned from all of them is that, bringing awareness to any of these habit cycles, whether it's emotional eating or anxiety or smoking or whatever, just bringing awareness itself, it's amazing how that can help people start to step out of these cycles.
Yeah. Yeah, it is really kind of remarkable, isn't it? That being aware actually weakens whatever is happening. It's like the culprit has been seen, and yeah. So, Jud, it does seem like some people do really well in difficult times. They thrive, and and they grow. And what do you think differentiates those people who are more resilient from those who aren't?
Yeah, great question. So one way to look at this is through the lens of fixed versus growth mindset. So there's a Stanford researcher, Carol Dweck, who wrote about this decades ago with the education literature, where she would talk about, kids who thought that they had they had a certain intellectual capacity and that was never going to change, that they actually did worse on certain tests, whereas the kids who were taught, hey, you can learn and grow, actually learned and grew and could do better. So I think mindfulness fits beautifully here around people who develop resilience versus those who don't, who get stuck in anxiety loops or whatever. So if you think of this, humans tend to have a comfort zone, right? And this goes back all the way to survival times. If you think of our ancient ancestors out on the savannah, if we go to a new part of the savannah and it's unfamiliar, it's important for us to be very vigilant because we don't know if it's dangerous, right? There could be a lion hiding behind a boulder or whatever that could come and eat us. So we have to be very vigilant when we're moving out of our comfort zone. As we learn that some place is safe, it becomes our comfort zone, right? And so we don't have to keep that vigilance up, and we can actually let our defenses down and rest, so to speak. So anytime we move out of our comfort zone into what's called the growth zone, that can feel uncertain. Now, at that moment, we can lean into that uncertainty and think, oh, here's something new. Maybe I can learn something. Or we can go, oh no, this is terrible. This is awful. And that shoves us into this outer ring of the panic zone, right?
Yeah.
Where our brain goes offline and we're just panicking like, oh, this is terrible, horrible. I'm going to get eaten by a lion or whatever. At least that's what our brain's saying. So the idea is, as we're moving out of our comfort zone, how are we relating to ourselves? Are we leaning into that uncertainty? Are we leaning into that discomfort that's saying, hey, this is new?
Yeah.
And if we can lean in, we can actually learn from these things. If we run away, we either run back to our comfort zone, we never grow, or we run into our panic zone and we do all sorts of stupid things. Not to do good, behaviors that are helpful when we're panicking.
Right.
And this gets pretty interesting because the way I think of this is, especially with habit change, when people are struggling with a habit, they can say, oh, I was trying to not eat this junk food and then I ate it. And, so I failed. It's like this 1 step forward, 2 steps backwards. But I think of it as every time, if you look at those situations of failure, you ate the junk food, if you lean into that, say, oh, I failed. What can I learn from this?
Yeah.
And we actually learn something. We might be learning something that we never would have learned if we were just in our comfort zone. Right. And so in essence, there is no such thing as moving backwards if we're always learning from everything.
Right.
So here I would say we can all develop resilience by leaning into the discomfort, right? Looking around, make sure there's no danger, right?
Yes.
This isn't about like stepping out in front of a car and going, oh, curious, what's it like to get hit by a car? No, probably not that helpful.
Right. Yeah.
But it's like leaning into these places and like, okay, no danger. Well, I feel uncomfortable. What is it? what can I learn from this?
Yeah,
Or,
yeah,
oh, I failed, quote unquote. Oh, well, what can I learn from this? And can I
yes.
actually grow from that experience?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So interesting because that's again, you're bringing in the awareness,
Hmm.
real like what is going on. And the more we can continue to incline our mind in that direction, we can make that a habit, right? We can incline that way to turn toward, to be with, to up the curiosity ante.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. All right, let's pivot a little bit and talk about sleep. Nobody's really getting sleep these days. I mean, talking to my family and friends and I mean, no one seems to be getting enough of it.
Hmm.
And with the backdrop again of, the social, political, environmental unrest that we're dealing with. And yet, um, sleep is so important for so many bodily functions.
Yeah.
And then that, my sister and I were talking about like the fact that sleep's so important and yet we're not really getting enough. And then we're worried because we're not getting the benefits we need from sleep.
Right.
Like we want inflammation in the body to be lower and we want to be able to think clearly and, and then there's the worry about, oh no, I'm like harming myself now because I'm not sleeping. Can you comment on sleep and how these
Yeah.
practices can help?
And, and I think you're hitting on what can lead to a vicious cycle. So I see this a lot in my patients who come to me. I would say 80 or 90% of my patients in my clinic, whether they have hardcore addictions or anxiety or binge eating or whatever, there many, if not, the majority of them have sleep issues. And so when I ask them, what's going on, and I can ask this one question because about 90% of them will raise their hand to this, where I say, when your head hits the pillow, does your brain say my turn and it starts doing this and it starts saying, oh, I can't believe I did that. Am I going to get this done tomorrow? Am I, and so their mind is kind of racing, regretting things they did in the past, worrying about the
Right.
future. And then they look at their clock and they think, oh crap, I need to get to sleep and I'm not getting to sleep. And that
Yes.
oh crap moment actually revs up their physiology. So it makes
Yeah.
it harder for them to get to sleep. And so that sets off this vicious cycle where they can't
Exactly.
actually sleep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So here I prescribe body scan, actually, this body scan meditation. I started playing with this when I was teaching the women's golf team at Yale. We were teaching them mindfulness to help them play golf. And I started as a way to kind of help them buy into the practice. I wanted to start with something that they could all relate to, that they didn't think was hokey or whatever. So I asked them about sleep. And of course, all of them were struggling with sleep.
Right.
And so I taught them this body scan practice, just to start to scan up from their toes up to their head, or scan down from their head down to their toes. And what that does is help people bring awareness to their present moment experience in a way that's not feeding that worry thought cycle.
Mm.
And as they do that, this starts to die down. And at the same time, if they're holding tension in some place of their body, they might even bring awareness to that. And just bringing awareness to places of tension, often it just kind of naturally relaxes on its own. We're like,
Yeah.
oh, my shoulders are tight. And then they just
Yes.
relax on their own.
Yes.
So here, I think mindfulness practices such as the body scan. Some people, I recommend loving kindness practice if they're struggling, with a lot of self-judgment.
Yeah.
Practicing loving kindness toward themselves. Many other types of mindfulness practices. Basically, anything that helps people not get caught up in their heads and kind of step out of that cycle can be really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I love that you brought up loving kindness practice because I think that is also like kind of the combination of the body scan and then wishing yourself well.
Mm-hmm.
There is, yeah, a lot of value in that.
Yeah, and my labs, even we published this like 5 or 6 years ago now, but we published a paper on the neuroscience of loving kindness practice. And in fact, the brain regions that get activated with worry, with
Yeah.
that perseverative worry, actually they quiet down with mindfulness practice. So we've even mapped out some of the neural mechanisms behind how that works.
Yeah, that's great. Jed, is there anything you're currently working on that excites you and or what would you like to study in the future?
Well, I'd like to study lots of things in the future. So one thing that a couple of things that we're studying are, these app-based mindfulness training programs. The world has just suddenly been shoved 5 years forward in terms of using digital technologies for mental health. For example, my
Yes.
clinic is now all online. The use of digital therapeutics, suddenly the National Institutes of Health is very interested in that, and they're putting out requests for applications for people to study these types of things.
Yeah.
So that's something my lab's been interested in studying this stuff for almost a decade now.
Yeah.
And we're really interested to see, how well can digital therapeutics actually work to change hardcore behaviors. We've had some positive studies. We just published one in 2019 showing that you can actually change brain activity using an app-based mindfulness training for smoking, for example. So we're hoping to do larger scale studies with things like eating, and with anxiety. We have some positive results there, but we'd like to take that further, where we can link a brain mechanism with clinical outcomes. Another thing from a pragmatic standpoint that we're looking at is just, what's it like when people actually identify this feeling of, feeling closed down, like when you're closed down, when you're anxious, versus that feeling of being opened up, like when you're joyful or when you're curious.
Yeah.
And is there an inherent reward value that all of our brains actually have as a metric that propels people naturally from things that are more closed down to things that are more open up? So for example, my friend Jake Davis wrote his entire PhD thesis in philosophy around, the embodied ethic. Basically, if you pay attention to your experience and you're doing an ethical versus an unethical behavior, are you more likely to do an ethical one just simply because it feels better? So here, for example, and this is, I think, really important for all of us, what does it feel like to feel self-righteous, or to be, to be in a group where you're beating down some other group, the hate, for example, that's an extreme example, where they can have this excited quality to it. But it actually, when you compare that, like the disconnection or the divisiveness, when you compare divisive to connected, what feels better? And can we put this in language that's objective, that doesn't have judgments attached to it? So open and closed doesn't have judgment, it just feels open, it just feels closed. But if we can help people start to see, and link up, and we've actually done studies with this now, anger tends to feel closed down.
Right.
And connectedness and kindness tend to feel open up. And there's actually a reward value preference where people prefer the open qualities of experience because they just feel better. So we'd like to continue that research to link up some of the biology around, I think, what almost all of us know, and probably all of us know when we really pay attention to it, is that, being a jerk doesn't feel nearly as good as being nice. And I think everybody can see the important ramifications of this. We're not going to make it as a planet, whether it's environmentally or politically or racially, if we are divisive, but we will make it if we're connected, because it just feels better.
It feels better. Wow, Jud, I love this line of research. I love where you're going with this and where your lab is going with this. Someone said, it might have been someone famous, or it could have simply been a bumper sticker, but it was, when I do bad, I feel bad. When I do good, I feel good.
And that's my religion. Yeah, that was Abraham Lincoln.
Okay.
Somebody famous. And it should be a bumper sticker.
It should be. And, I love that, because I think, well, even like if somebody says something and you come back with a reactive, something reactive that you then later regret, the moment of coming out with that can sometimes oddly feel good and powerful, but it leaves you with such a long trail of regret, and this is a really interesting area, because I do believe that most human beings, barring any kind of sociopathic, problem, feel good when they are open and spacious and curious and interested. Like, that's a good place to be. But being tight and contracted it's not pleasant, but it's not always seen as unpleasant.
Yeah, yeah, and you probably know this saying. There's this ancient Buddhist saying from the ancient teachings where they talk about anger as anger with its honeyed tip and
Yes.
poisoned root,
Yes.
right? And so that's what you're talking about.
Yes.
It tastes good going in, but
Yeah.
it kind of gives us indigestion when we really look at it.
Completely. And I think, the capacity, I mean, these practices can really shine a light on these things that we don't necessarily see so clearly, but when we start to see them more clearly, we can then do something about them and then start to see how the other feels like. And again, this whole idea of, test it, what do you notice, when you start to give these practices a try, what do you notice? You were not involved with the mindfulness world and doing the research that you're doing. If you could do anything, what would you do? What would you be, or what would you do?
I would do whatever I could to help increase the connectedness in this world. There's so much divisiveness right now that just feels like everybody needs to be working in the direction of bringing us together. So that's what I would do. And my free time, I would surf as much as I could.
That's great. I'd love to hear about that another time. And then, is there anything else I should have asked that I didn't, that you would like to say about your research, about your lab? We will, in the show notes, make sure people know how to reach you. But is there anything that I should have asked that I didn't?
One thing I'll mention is that I've put out a bunch of short videos on YouTube around helping people deal with uncertainty, binging on news, grief, all these things. So if those resources are helpful, folks can just find that. It's just Dr. Jud, D-R-J-U-D. They can search that on YouTube.
Okay.
And in one of those videos, I talk about, we've learned some new science terms, all of us, and or not, like how infectious a virus is, and, infection curves and things like that. So what I would say is, things can spread, emotions can spread more quickly and can be even more contagious than physical viruses. So here I would say, let's look at kindness as this new contagion, and, let's all deem to kill each other with kindness, whether it's simply wearing a face mask, because that's an act of kindness. Whether it's, whatever, these small acts of kindness, let those become really, really, really infectious. So instead of flattening the curve, let's increase that curve of kindness, let's increase that R naught. Let's have that one actually go off the charts as we work with this other pandemic.
Oh, this is such a good place to end, Jud. And Ajahn Brahm calls it kindfulness,
I love it.
And let's bring more of it into this world that is so desperately in need of it. So that's a beautiful place to end. And thank you so much for your willingness to give your time to us today.
My pleasure.